Welcome, class, to Understanding the edTPA Assignment Part 1. This lecture will only cover Part 1, which is due next week, September 22nd, and it's worth 10% of your grade. If you go into the Assignments folder, you'll see folders for all the major assignments in this course. Click on the edTPA Assessment Project, which should be the folder at the top of the page. Once you're in the edTPA Assessment folder, you'll see a list of files. You'll want to open the instructions for parts 1 and 2, even though we're not talking about part 2 in this lecture. Part 1 is in that file. You'll also want to open the learning template because we'll be discussing each of these. Do not click on the submission link that says due November 10th. That's where you submit your completed project. So go ahead and open those files up. Pause the video if you need to. What you see before you now is the instructions for the assignment. First, a quick overview of the assignment. The whole thing is not due until November, and it's worth 30% of your course grade, 10% each part. This assignment is meant to give you a taste for what the edTPA will require of you. You're going to do the edTPA when you're student teaching, and so this just sort of mimics the assessment part of that assignment. You're going to select a standard for a 3 to 5 lesson learning segment that you would like to teach. You're going to select a standard and create a learning target to go along with that standard. You should be learning about what these are through the lecture this past week. Then you will develop a lesson to teach the learning target. You're going to design 3 assessments. 2 of them are going to be formative assessments, that is, assessments that you would help you understand what students know ahead of the lesson and during the time you're teaching, and a summative assessment in the form of a quiz to assess learning after teaching is finished. You're going to teach the lesson and pilot the quiz with 1 student. This doesn't have to be an actual student. It could be a family member, it could be a friend, but it should be a child at or near the age that the content is of the standard is for. So if you're using a 4th grade standard, should be a child in or around 4th grade. You're going to analyze and graph some hypothetical data from the quiz to look for patterns of learning. You're going to provide meaningful student feedback and reflect on the assignment and next steps for teaching or reteaching. The bolded words that you see here are edTPA vocabulary that you should be familiar with, and definitions for them are provided both in lecture this week and also at the end of this document. The things that you should be able to do, the student learning objectives, are listed here. So you can see align a standard, a central learning focus, and a learning objective, although we're going to technically use learning targets, which are, as we're learning, like learning objectives, but with a target for success. You can read through the SLOs there. So what is due next week? September 22nd is planning the lesson. So first you should go into the standards folder and select a learning standard. It should be appropriate for the grade level of the lesson you're planning. So, and it should be aligned with your level of certification. So if you're in adolescent education, teaching middle school or high school, you should not choose an elementary standard and vice versa. You should determine a central focus and a learning segment. So the lecture goes into this somewhat this week. A central focus is more like a goal in that it's longer term. It usually takes longer. So what is the focus of that? And what is the learning segment? Usually three lessons or so to teach towards the learning focus. And then you're going to develop a learning target. writing a learning target for one of the lessons. So only one, pick one lesson and say what you want students to be able to accomplish. Remember, learning targets need to be specific and measurable, and they need to have a target for success. Once you have your standard, your central focus, and your learning target developed, then you need to plan the lesson around it. How will you teach the lesson so that students will master the learning target? And this is going to be written out in a few paragraphs, and it consists of 4 steps. The learning segment. So hypothetically, where would this lesson occur in the learning segment? So what would students have learned and what would they learn next? So let's say you're teaching 2-digit multiplication by 2-digit multiplication. So you might have a central focus about students being able to um, complete multiplication and division problems that are more complex, and your learning segment might be doing 1-digit multiplication and then 2-digit multiplication, and this would be the final lesson where you teach them 2-digit multiplication. What prerequisite knowledge will they need to know? So, for example, obviously multiplication, they need to know. They need to know how to group numbers. They need to know how to do simple multiplication, how to understand place value, carrying numbers, etc. And then how will you know that they understand that prerequisite knowledge? Because that won't do any good to teach them if they don't have the skills they need to understand the lesson. And what will you do if you discover they do not? Misconceptions. So this is where you really get to shine in your expertise in your content area. What misconceptions might occur. In the example of science, for example, there are many misconceptions that students have. If they don't understand the difference between living things and inanimate objects, that might trip them up in certain science lessons, for example. And then finally, what specific steps will be required to teach the lesson? This doesn't have to be a great amount of detail, but it should be clear enough so that the reader can get a really good understanding of what the lesson is about and what's going on. This is all due September 22nd. Now, the second file I asked you to open, which is the template, is where you actually record your answers. So use the instructions and the details in the instructions, but type your answers on the template. So each of these places, like Learning Standard, has a number. 1.1 Learning Standard, you can see typing it out in full will be worth 1 point. Writing the learning focus in the learning segment will be worth 2 points. Writing the learning target will be worth 1 point. Your lesson itself will be worth 6 points, and so that comes to 10 points. Now, this will all be submitted on September 22nd, and I will provide feedback. And then I don't want you to revise and resubmit this because it's going to be graded on participation. That is, if you submit this as a part of next week's module assignment, you'll get the minor 1 or 2 points for the module, whatever it is. But what I do want you to do is to take my feedback into account and then make any changes on your document in red so that the next time you submit, which will be for part 2, I can go back and make sure that you have taken my comments into consideration, and I can look at the red parts and see if you've gotten a better part 1. Leave my comments in place, please, so don't delete them. That way I can refer to what I said you should do, and I can look at your red comments. So again, you're going to submit this part 1 by September 22nd. I'll provide feedback. You go back and look at my feedback, leave the comments in place, but make any changes to part 1 in red. And then, of course, you're going to add to it by doing part 2, which will come later, and submit parts 1 and 2 together at a later date. If you have any questions about any of this, please feel free to email me.